Denver, Colorado. The autumn of 1888. A widowed father stepped through the door of Miller's General Store, an infant nestled against his shoulder and a battered tin of milk gripped in his free hand. Neither he nor anyone watching could have guessed that before the season turned to spring, the richest woman in all of Colorado would gamble everything she owned, her fortune, her name, her heart for the sake of that man and his child. A gust of icy wind trailed Elias Thorne inside, kicking up dust along the worn planks of the floor. His coat had gone thin at the elbows. His boots were split at the seams, and the baby, wrapped against his chest, wore a blanket so threadbare it barely counted as cloth anymore. Over by a display of imported teas, a woman named Sarah Sterling stood quietly watching. At 45, Sarah possessed more wealth than half the men in Denver combined. A grand estate, shares in silver mines, enough acreage that every window of her home framed a view of the peaks. And yet, since burying her only child years before, the halls of that mansion had echoed with nothing but silence. What caught her attention wasn't the man's ragged clothes. It was the way he cradled that baby. Not out of duty, not out of habit, but as though the small life in his arms was the one thing left in this world he refused to lose. From the shadow of the dry goods shelves, Sarah studied the exhaustion carved into his face, the desperation swimming behind his reddened eyes. Elias approached the heavy counter with the reluctant steps of a man who hated what he was about to do. Behind it stood Silas Miller, spectacles balanced on the edge of his nose, more interested in the columns of his ledger than in the people standing before him. Back again. Are you Elias? Silas said, without so much as glancing up. His tone carried all the warmth of a closed door. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the small tin down on the counter, its label peeling, its edges dented. Faded lettering across the front still read, "Condensed milk. For infants. I need to return this," he said finally. His voice scraped raw from more than just the cold. Silas set down his pen and looked up slowly, adjusting his glasses. "You took that on credit 3 days back. I know. So what's changed?" "I can't cover what I owe." Elias's arms tightened around the small bundle he carried. "They let half the men go at the mine yesterday. I was one of them." Silas let out a dry, joyless chuckle. "This ain't a charity, Thorne. I gave you that tin on nothing but your word. And now the seal's scratched, the tin's dented. I can't even sell it as new." Elias stared down at his boots, caked in stiff prairie mud. "Please, Silas." He glanced at the child in his arms. "He needs this. But I also need coin for firewood tonight." His voice cracked. "If I keep the milk, he might freeze tonight. If I hand it back, he goes hungry." As if on cue, the baby let out a thin, brittle cry, the kind of sound that seemed to reach into every chest in the room. Most of the customers looked away, unwilling to stare too long at what poverty actually looked like up close. But Sarah didn't look away. She noticed the tremor in Elias's hands rough with callus, stained by years of labor, and how, despite everything, they held that infant with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible. "No returns on goods that have been opened or handled," Silas said flatly, snapping his ledger shut with a hard final sound. "Take your tin and get out. Come back when you've got real money." Elias froze, humiliation rolling off him in waves. His knuckles whitened as he reached for the tin. The baby's cry rose into something more desperate, more raw. That sound cut straight through 20 years of silence inside. Sarah, her son, Leo, had died of scarlet fever before he ever saw his 7th birthday. She could still remember the last night she'd held him and the terrible quiet that followed. She could not stand by and let another child cry while grown men looked the other way. She stepped out from behind the shelves, the rustle of her silk skirts cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Miller." Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly without doubt. Silas straightened at once, his expression shifting the moment he recognized her. "Mrs. Sterling, forgive me. I didn't see you there. What can I do for you?" She didn't so much as glance at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ragged man beside the counter. Elias looked back at her, taking in her fine jewelry, her carefully arranged hair, a whole world of comfort he'd never come close to touching. "Put the milk back in his bag," Sarah said. Silas blinked. "But, ma'am, he owes." "I didn't ask about his debt." She reached into her small velvet purse and produced a gleaming gold coin, setting it down with a firm click. "This will clear whatever he owes. It'll also buy 6 more tins of that milk to see the boy through winter, 2 sacks of your finest flour, and the warmest wool blankets you keep in the back. The store fell utterly silent. Even the whispering stopped. Only the crackle of the stove remained. Elias stared at the coin as if it had fallen from the sky. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't take handouts, ma'am." Sarah turned to face him fully, her expression softening. "This isn't charity, Mr. Thorne. This is one parent reaching out to another who knows exactly what it costs to lose a child." Her gaze dropped to the baby. "Winder doesn't care about pride. Tonight, your son needs to be warm, far more than you need to owe nobody." Elias looked down at his crying son, cheeks flushed red, tiny fists beating against the thin blanket, and something in him finally gave way. A single tear cut a path through the dust on his face. "I've got nothing to give you back," he whispered. "Then give it back by keeping him safe," Sarah said. "And when you're back on your feet, help someone who has even less than you." Silas hurried to gather everything. Elias quietly set the flour aside. "The milk and one blanket will do," he said. "I won't take more than the boy needs." Sarah studied him a long moment. Most men reached for everything within grasp. This man, who had almost nothing, was trying to leave something behind. Silas returned the flour to its shelf and packed the milk with a single wool blanket. Sarah watched as Elias struggled to lift the crate one-handed while still cradling his son, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "Wait," she said. "My carriage is outside. Let my driver take you home." Elias hesitated. The distance between their two lives felt as wide as a canyon. "I live down by the rail yards, in the shanties. No place for a lady's carriage to go. A carriage is only wood and leather and wheels," Sarah said. "It goes wherever it's told." She led him out into the biting Denver afternoon, the wind clawing at their coats. Her driver, Thomas, stood waiting by the polished brougham, unbothered by the sight of the ragged man beside her. He'd served Sarah long enough to recognize something waking up in her. He helped Elias climb inside, and the man sat rigidly on the fine velvet cushions, almost afraid to touch them. As the carriage rolled forward, the baby's crying finally settled, lulled by the warmth of the cabin. Elias watched the brick buildings slide past the window. "Elias Thorne," he said quietly. "And this is Samuel." "Sarah," she replied. "Tell me how you came to be here." He told her about his wife, Martha, how she'd died shortly after Samuel was born, out at a remote mining camp, the nearest doctor arriving far too late. He told her of a dream he still carried, of owning a small ranch somewhere near the foothills. He'd come west chasing gold, and found instead nothing but backbreaking labor and grief. Sarah listened, her chest tightening with every word. Here was a man who had given up everything, drowning in bad fortune he never deserved. When they reached the shanties, Sarah was stunned by what she saw. Homes built from scrap tin and broken crates, wind slicing straight through the gaps in the walls, children playing barefoot in frozen mud. It was a forgotten corner of the world. Elias climbed out, balancing the crate and his son. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. I'll find some way to repay this. Just keep him warm," Sarah said. "That's payment enough." As the carriage pulled away, she looked back once and saw him standing there in the gray mud, a solitary figure against a bleak sky. She knew in that moment, she could not simply drive away and forget him. That evening, she crossed her silent hallway and unlocked a door that had stayed shut for 2 decades. Leo's small wooden horse still sat on the mantel. His little coat still hung behind the door. She lifted the framed photograph beside his old bed, and for one unsettling moment, she wondered if helping Samuel was really about him or about filling the hole Leo had left behind. "No," she whispered into the empty room. No child could ever replace him, but cherishing his memory didn't mean turning her back on another child who needed help. She set the photo down gently and rang for Thomas. The next morning brought a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire city. She summoned her lawyer and her estate manager. "I want the old foreman's cottage reopened," she announced. "The one up on the North Ridge. And I want a groundskeeper hired at once." "But ma'am," her manager objected. "We haven't kept a groundskeeper in 5 years. The grounds are perfectly fine as they are." "The grounds are dead and cold," Sarah replied sharply. "I want someone who knows how to bring land back to life." She sent Thomas to the shanties with a written offer. 2 hours later, the carriage returned, and Elias stepped out, wary and defensive, still wrapped in the same threadbare coat. Sarah met him on the wide stone porch. "There's a cottage on the North Hill, stone hearth, a small garden plot. It just needs someone willing to bring it back. Fair wages, and the milk continues." Elias didn't reach for the offered keys. You've already given us too much. I won't live on your land as some object of your pity. You won't be, Sarah said. You'll earn your wages like anyone else, and if I fail, then I'll let you go, same as I would any other worker. For the first time, the edge of Elias's mouth almost curved upward. Take a week to look the cottage over, Sarah continued. If the work seems unfair, walk away, owing me nothing. Elias glanced at the towering mansion, then toward the distant cottage tucked among the pines. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know me. I know what it's like to be alone, Sarah said. And Samuel deserves a warm room, real windows, and mountains to watch the sun rise over. Elias looked down at his sleeping son, wrapped now in soft new blankets, then back toward the cottage. I'll earn every dollar of it, he said, and only then did he take the keys. The weeks that followed brought a storm of whispers. The wealthy widow had taken in a drifter. The ladies of the Denver Social Club murmured over their teacups. She's lost her senses, they said. A man like that will rob her blind. It's a disgrace having him on her property. Sarah paid none of it any mind. Each afternoon, she found herself walking up to the cottage, the walk clearing her thoughts and warming something in her chest. She brought small carved toys for Samuel, leather-bound books for Elias. She watched him mend the split rail fence, the steady rhythm of his hammer ringing through the cold air, color slowly returning to his cheeks. Through that first month, Elias took nothing beyond his agreed pay. When Sarah left a basket of food at his door, he sent half of it back. When Thomas mistakenly overpaid him by $1, Elias trudged through the snow to return it. He fixed the fence, cleared the frozen well, brought the neglected orchard back to life, all without being asked. Sarah had spent years surrounded by men who flattered her fortune while quietly calculating what they could take from it. Elias never once asked what she owned. He only asked what work needed doing. And she noticed, more than anything, the way his whole face changed whenever he looked at his son. One evening, the first true snowfall of December began, thick, soft flakes drifting down like feathers. Sarah stayed late at the cottage that night, the two of them sitting by the small, crackling hearth. The room was a fraction of the size of her grand ballroom, yet it held a warmth her mansion never had. Found this in the garden today, Elias said, holding out a smooth river stone, shaped almost perfectly like a heart. Used to find these for Martha, he said softly. Wanted you to have this one. Sarah took the stone into her palm, her fingers brushing his rough skin, and felt something stir that she hadn't felt in years. Something real, something unguarded. This was no longer only about charity. The realization frightened her. She had loved a husband. She had buried a son. She had survived by locking away every tender part of herself. What if Elias only saw her fortune? Worse, what if she was only using Samuel to fill the space Leo had left behind? She closed her fingers around the stone. For the first time in a long while, she had something to lose again, but the world outside was not so gentle. A few days later, a group of men gathered at her gate, members of the town council, led by a man named Harrison Vane, an old rival of her late husband. A man who reeked of cigar smoke and ambition. Mrs. Sterling, Harrison began, his smile cold and rehearsed. There are concerns being raised about your new hire. He spoke out at a workers' gathering in Leadville before he was let go. Certain investors are calling him a troublemaker now. Sarah glanced toward the cottage. Was he charged with a crime? No, then what you've brought me is gossip, not evidence. She held her ground on the marble steps. He is my employee, and my guest. He has done nothing but work hard and raise his son with more honor than you could manage. The North Ridge was recorded under an outdated survey, Harrison pressed. My lawyers believe the boundary could be challenged. If you insist on sheltering this man, I may petition the court to freeze every transaction tied to that land. It was a direct strike at her entire fortune. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. She knew what Harrison really wanted, her silver claims. He'd circled her estate like a vulture for years, and if she didn't yield now, she stood to lose it all. That night, she told Elias about the visit, trying and failing to hide the fear behind her eyes. But Elias understood the weight of a threat better than most. I should leave tonight, he said, his voice flat with old, familiar pain. I've caused you enough trouble. I'll take Samuel south, find work in another camp. No, Sarah said, catching his hand. If you leave, the bullies win and Samuel goes right back into the cold. I won't allow that. But your fortune, Sarah. Your standing in this town, my money has bought me nothing but walls, she said. My standing is built on ghosts and shadows. I would rather lose their approval than turn away from what I know is right. My wealth has shielded me from hardship, Elias. It has never once shielded me from loneliness. It was a bold thing for any woman to say in 1888, when a woman's reputation was often her only currency. Standing beside a poor laborer against Denver's most powerful men could ruin her standing entirely. But Sarah Sterling had grown tired of living by rules that had never once served her heart. By morning, she had made her decision. Rather than call her lawyer to fight Harrison in private, she called for a public gathering at the town square. If Sarah's courage has moved you, drop a comment below. Would you have risked everything for Elias and Samuel the way she did? Back on the snow-covered streets of Denver, Sarah stood on a platform before the courthouse. A crowd gathered thick in the cold, curious and quick to judge. Harrison stood front and center, wearing a smug, expectant grin. I have an announcement, Sarah said, her voice carrying clear across the square. I have signed a protected 5-year lease of the Northridge cottage to Elias Thorne. Should he fulfill the terms of the agreement and improve the land, he will hold the legal right to purchase the homestead for $1. The agreement is signed, witnessed, and filed with the county clerk. Elias hadn't known about the purchase clause. His jaw tightened not with greed, but with the fear of being given more than he'd earned. Sarah caught his eye across the crowd and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not a gift, the gesture seemed to say. A future you'll have to build yourself, and, Sarah continued, I am investing my silver shares into a new venture, a nursery and school for the children of the rail workers of this city. A single collective gasp swept the crowd. This was no ordinary scandal. This was a woman handing power down to the people at the very bottom. Harrison's face turned a furious shade of red. You can't do this, he shouted. Those shares belong to the Sterling name. They belong to me, to use as I see fit, Sarah replied evenly. And if you challenge this agreement, you'll have to explain in open court why a lawful employee and his infant son threaten you so deeply. She stepped down from the platform, and the crowd parted before her like water. Elias stood waiting by the carriage with Samuel. Is it over? He asked. No, Elias, she said. It's only just beginning. But that victory carried a heavy cost. Invitations to Sarah's home dried up overnight. 2 banks refused to extend credit toward her school project. 3 merchants canceled their contracts with the Sterling estate. Anonymous letters arrived, warning her to cast Elias out before she lost everything her husband had ever built. For several nights, Sarah sat alone in her study, with those letters scattered before her, wondering whether courage and foolishness were separated by nothing more than a single misstep. And yet each morning, she'd look toward the cottage chimney, and as long as smoke rose from it, she knew Samuel was safe and warm. That was enough to carry her forward. Her mansion began to feel too large, too hollow. More and more, she found herself spending her days at the cottage instead, helping Elias plant a winter garden, building a small glass greenhouse together, learning to scrub heavy laundry by hand, learning how to calm a fussing, teething Samuel. Elias, in turn, made his own quiet sacrifice. He knew Sarah missed the finer comforts of her old life, so late into the night, by candlelight, he began carving furniture from solid oak gathered off the mountainside, crafting her a vanity table more beautiful than anything shipped from Europe, shaping every inch by hand, determined to prove himself worthy of what she'd given him. But the greatest trial of all was still to come. In late December, one of the fiercest blizzards Denver had seen in years tore down from the peaks. By nightfall, temperatures had plunged far below freezing. Snow swallowed the roads, buried the fences, and stacked itself against every building in towering white walls. Inside the mansion, Sarah sat alone by the fire, the house groaning against the force of the wind, her thoughts consumed with worry for the small cottage on the hill, its walls thick stone, but its roof old and worn. Then came a violent pounding at the service door. She threw it open to find Elias standing there, coated in a crust of ice, his face gone a ghastly shade of blue, gasping for breath and air too cold to draw. The roof gave in, he choked out. The snow was too heavy. Where's Samuel? Sarah screamed into the howling wind. I wrapped him in every blanket we had and set him in the root cellar, Elias gasped. The old cellar still held some warmth beneath the frozen ground. He'd packed it with straw, bundled Samuel inside every blanket they owned, and wedged the milk crate beside him as a shield against falling debris. A beam's fallen across the opening. I can't reach him alone. Without a second thought, Sarah grabbed her fur cloak. The household staff had already retreated to the mansion's lower rooms, and there was no time to summon anyone else. She and Elias plunged out into the white chaos, the wind nearly flattening them both. Elias tore off his own coat and threw it around her shoulders. "You'll need it more," she protested. "So will you," he said. "I can't lose another person to this cold." They fought their way up the ridge on hands and knees, blinded by the driving snow. When they reached the cottage, it lay in ruins. The roof collapsed inward, snow pouring through the gap, the cellar door buried beneath fallen timber. "Samuel!" Elias called out. A faint cry answered from below. Together they tore through the wreckage, hands going numb. Until Elias finally heaved a massive oak beam aside with nothing but the raw strength of a desperate father. Sarah reached through the opening and pulled out the wool blanket, and a moment later, Samuel was in her arms, cold, frightened, but alive. The crate and blankets from Miller's store had shielded him from the worst of it. They huddled together in the ruined cottage as the storm raged around them like something alive. Elias wrapped his arms around them both, shielding them with his own body against the ice. "We need to get back to the main house," he said. "I can't feel my legs," Sarah whispered. "You have to move," Elias urged. "For him, Sarah, you have to." He tucked Samuel securely beneath his coat, pulled Sarah's arm across his shoulders, and helped her rise. Step by agonizing step, they pushed through the storm. When her legs finally failed entirely, Elias carried her the rest of the way, stumbling through drifts, falling twice, rising both times. When they finally burst through the mansion doors, they collapsed together onto the rug of the great hall. Sarah managed to coax the dying fire back to life, and there they lay, shivering, spent, alive. By morning, the sun rose over a world blanketed in white, and silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the empty kind. Sarah opened her eyes to find Elias beside the fire, Samuel held against his chest, his other hand still wrapped around hers. "You stayed?" she whispered. Elias looked at her as though the answer had never been in question. "So did you." Over the following year, Sarah sold the mansion and moved into a smaller home up on the North Ridge. She kept just enough of her silver holdings to fund the workers' school and rebuild the cottage into a proper ranch house. Elias didn't propose right away. He waited until the orchard bore its first fruit, and until every term of their agreement had been fulfilled. On the evening he signed the deed to the homestead, he pressed the heart-shaped stone into her palm once more. "The first time I gave you this," he said, "I had nothing else to offer, and now I have a home, a son, and a life I want to share with you." Sarah closed her fingers around the stone. "You had all of that before, Elias. You only needed someone to see it." They married beneath the young orchard trees, Samuel asleep in Thomas's arms. She no longer cared what the town gossips whispered. She was no longer simply the wealthy widow, she was just Sarah, a woman who had found a family inside a storm. Elias grew into a respected rancher, his labor turning dry, barren land into fields of green. Samuel grew tall and strong, a true child of the frontier. They lived simply, far from the polished halls of Denver society, never again the wealthiest family in Colorado. But in every way that truly mattered, they had become the richest, rich in warmth, in purpose, in laughter, in someone waiting for them at the end of each day. Sarah finally understood that true wealth was never measured by what a person kept, but by what they were willing to give away. Years later, Samuel walked into Miller's general store with a son of his own. Near the old stove, Sarah and Elias sat side by side, hands resting together between them. The boy pointed toward a dusty, dented tin displayed above the counter. "Why does grandfather keep that old thing?" he asked. Elias smiled at him. "It started with a return," the old man said, "and it ended with a whole new beginning." Sarah leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. On the mantel beside that old tin sat the heart-shaped stone. Loving again had never erased Leo from her heart. It had simply let his memory grow into something larger than her grief. She smiled, certain now, at the end of it all, that love was the only inheritance truly worth leaving behind. If Sarah and Elias's story moved you, tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you longest. The returned tin of milk, the heart-shaped stone, or the rescue in the storm. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes kindness can change a life. In our next story, a frontier nurse risks everything to save a town that once turned its back on her, and carries a secret no one uncovers until years later. Until then, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep the spirit of the American West alive.